doing a retreat, and I took a cab ride from the airport to the worship center, right, or to the retreat center. And on the way, I had an opportunity to share a really good bit of humor with the cab driver. Or I should say the cab driver shared a bit of humor with me. Cab driver said, Father, he said, would you be opposed to hearing a joke? And I said, dude, like I'm made of them. So he says, okay, there was a priest and a cab driver, and they happened to die almost simultaneously. The cab driver actually died just a little bit before the priest. They both made it up to the pearly gates, and they got to the pearly gates, and Jesus was there, and he said, well, the cab driver died just minutes before you, Father, so I got to take him in first. So, Father's like, no problem, let him in. He takes the cab driver in, and he shows him just this palatial, like McMansion, right? It's got a pool, a hot tub, it's got its own gourmet chef, got a beautiful kitchen. It's just like everything. It even has an ocean view, The cabbie is like, sweet, This is like awesome. Because he told the priest on the way, he said, I haven't been to church since I've been in 8th grade. I hit confirmation, I was done. I haven't been to church at all. And so he's like rejoicing. He gets done, and St. Peter says, I got to get to the priest, I'll come back if you have any questions. And the cabbie's like, no problem, dude. So he runs off, and Jesus runs out, and he gets the priest, and he takes the priest on this pretty long journey, kind of up a hilly mountain, and it's kind of way back in the back part of the kingdom of heaven, and he's got a nice place. It's it's not bad, but it's just one room and a bathroom, So it's like a postage stamp, and it's nice. Everything's there. Everything's new. It's all cool. It faces the proverbial garbage dump of heaven, but it's not bad. The next morning, the cabbie shows up at the priest's door, and he says, dude, it was so nice meeting you yesterday. Why don't you come down to the place for lunch, and we'll have lunch together. And the priest is like, well, that's pretty nice, and new friend. So he goes down, and he meets the cabbie for lunch, and of course, it's just like blow me away, right? He's got this beautiful place, his own gourmet chef. He's like, and they have a nice lunch together. The priest says, I got to go, and the cabbie says, well, it's nice to meet you. Maybe we can get together up at your place sometime. And he said, sure. He said he made a beeline right over to Jesus' house. He knocks on the door. He says, dude, we have to have a conversation. Angel says, well, Jesus is a little busy right now, but you can come in. You can sit down in the parlor and wait for him. And sure enough, he did that. And a little bit, Jesus showed up. And he says, Father, it's so good to see you, man. Just this second day, this is like awesome. Thanks for stopping in. And they said, why don't, let me get you something to drink. Let's go sit in the garden. They did that. And they were sitting out there, and the priest is trying to get up the courage to confront Jesus, because he's a little pissed about the cabbie. And so he finally gets up enough gumption, and he says, Jesus, he says, I know this is probably none of my business, none whatsoever, but I have to tell you, I'm a little upset because I had dedicated my entire life to serving you and the gospel and spreading the good news and doing absolutely everything I could do to make sure that this was all working. And the cabbie told me on the way over that he hadn't even made it past 8th grade in church, and he had never even been there. And, so I'm not being judgmental, but it sounds a little unfair. It feels a little unfair. And I'm a little ticked. And Jesus says, well, Father, he says, I really appreciate everything that you've done. I know you dedicated your whole life. You've actually initiated many people into the kingdom of heaven. There's a lot of people here because of you. And he said, your homilies were halfway decent. Some people slept through them, some people, but you did okay. But he said, let me tell you about the cabbie, okay? The cabbie, he's got a better record than anybody in this entire kingdom of God. Because every time somebody got into his cab, they thought it was the end of the world. They started to pray like they've never prayed before. They swear that their life flashed before their eyes. They had visions of angels, and they were convinced that they had a religious experience. So there's a lot of people here because of him. I know, that was a long story, wasn't it? It was a good one. You know, my friends, I've been on this journey of faith for a long time, like you all have. I've been on this journey, and what I often find is that we focus ourselves, right? We focus our time and our energy on what might happen. I don't know about y'all, but you know, you can watch TV and it doesn't take you very long to find somebody who's preaching about the end of times, you know? And they're reading Revelation or Daniel or some apocalyptic literature, and they're saying, oh, see, this is happening, you know, the end of the world. It's happening because global warming's happening. We all know it is. All that stuff is true, but, you know, whether you can really make that connection or not, I don't know. The big question, though, for me is, so what? So what? Why do we need to know about when the world's going to end? What difference is that going to make? What good would knowing when the end is going to come? The journey of the spiritual life isn't about figuring out when that end is going to get here, right? It's like, because what are we going to do differently? Like, I always thought about this. I think about it this way. I think, what would I do? Like, party like crazy until a week before. I know it's going to end in 2 weeks. I'm going to party like crazy this week. I'll go to confession on Sunday, and then the rest of the week I'll be really good, and we'll be all reconciled, and you know, then we're cool, right? Like, what am I going to do differently? What are we going to do differently, actually, to assure our place in heaven? If somehow we discerned the accuracy, if we actually knew when the end of the world was going to come or when our lives were going to end, what would we be doing now? Or what would we want to be doing? Does it really matter if the world's going to end today or tomorrow or tonight or in 2050? And if it does, why aren't we doing something different now in order to be on that part of the journey together, right? What would we do differently? The lucky thing is we're not actually in bad company, because you heard tonight the disciples were asking the exact same thing of Jesus. Oh, you know, when you get into the kingdom, will I have a place? Remember that story? Right? And tonight it's like, oh, am I going to make it through the narrow? Who's going to be saved? Who isn't going to be? I was like, dude, you're worried about the wrong question. You're worried about the wrong question, and I think we're asking ourselves the wrong question. I think Jesus, every time he gets asked something like that, offers a consistent reply that's throughout Scripture, and whenever you read it, you'll see it. Jesus always ends up saying, maybe blatantly and maybe sometimes not so blatantly, but always says, listen, it's about love. It's all about love. Love God, love your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. Love is actually the narrow gate. Love is actually the test for the kingdom of heaven. Love is the measure of our holiness. Yes, I truly do believe it is about love. It's honestly, I think, that simple. And at the same time, it's that complicated and it's that challenging, right? The journey of the spiritual life is not a journey of trying to discern when the end of the world will come. The journey of the spiritual life is a journey about figuring out how to love. How to love in the midst of overwhelming joy, and how to love in the midst of overwhelming disappointment. How do we love in gratitude when a person places themselves and their lives at risk in life for us? And how do we love when we've been mortally injured by the words and the actions of others? How do we love when we share profound respect and love for one another? And how do we love when others wish us only ill and harm? That's what it's about, figuring out how to live in love. How do we love? There are many narrow gates, I think, in our lives. There's many narrow doors, and God is inviting us into those doors every day of our lives. I hope that this week we can spend some time as we walk through our lives saying, where is God inviting me into that narrow door? Where is God inviting me to live in love when I really don't want to love? Where is God inviting me to be kind and merciful to a person whom I think is a real stupid idiot, right? That's the hard part. That's where living love really becomes a challenge. When do we find it challenging is extremely difficult for us to understand and extremely difficult to live into. I think it is much wiser to leave the who's in heaven and who's out of heaven question, that question that the disciples asked Jesus. I think it's much easier to just leave that question for God instead of trying to figure it out ourselves. And maybe we focus our time on how do we love, especially when it's so challenging to do so. Because I am convinced when we get to the pearly gates, much like the priest and the cabbie, if you will, I'm convinced when we get to the pearly gates, the question that we're going to be asked is this: where are your scars? Not, did you live life perfectly?